the community that looks nicer is the one that has an HOA.
I think there was a CAI study actually here a number of years ago that put it at about a 10% bump in value for a home in an HOA to a comparable home not.
Most people are not equipped to understand the seemingly endless facets of an HOA. That's why we're here, to help you become uncommonly prepared to serve your HOA. Whether you're a board member or a manager, join us in the Uncommon Area.
Welcome to the Uncommon Area. I'm Matthew Holbrook, and this episode is all about what are the biggest challenges facing HOAs in the coming decade. And here to discuss that with us is Nathan McGuire of McGuire, Schubert, Sohal. And just really glad to have you joining us here, Nathan. I know that you have been involved in both CAI CLAC for many years and in addressing what's going on legislatively in California, as well as CAI National. And I know that you have a lot of experience and insight into what is happening with HOAs, and so appreciate you being part of this. So we're going to talk about the biggest challenges facing HOAs in the next decade.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and really, for me, especially coming from a legislative perspective, I think that the biggest challenges that HOAs face is this perception that HOAs are bad, that HOAs are not a place where people want to live. And so basically we have a misperception of HOAs that we need to really work hard to clean up. So we're really talking about homeowner satisfaction. And it's been my experience in my career as an attorney in this industry that misperceptions about homeowner satisfaction and specific issues can often lead to legislation in the industry. And a lot of those misconceptions can be cleaned up. We do our best to educate the legislature. And in many cases, some of the worst stories that you hear are either really not bad once you kind of dive in and understand the details and work through it and make sense, or it's really a one-off situation where very rarely we have a bad board, or we have a community that is struggling so bad that it's just really not a great place to live. But it seems like the industry or the media in particular has kind of made a joke about HOAs, and really most of what you'll see and hear in the media, in the news, online, on social media is not accurate in terms of what HOAs actually do and the actual level of satisfaction in communities. But I think we are at a crossroads because we see these things happening. They get the attention. The negative things always get the attention. It's never, hey, there's this great community that's doing so well and everybody loves it and the board is really well run and management does a great job. I mean, that's never in the news. It's like other things, what's in the news, crime and challenging stories and things like that. So I do think we're at a crossroads, and I don't mind mentioning it, but I think a lot of people who will listen to this or see this will probably by now have seen or heard about the John Oliver segment
Right.
on HOAs, and that's the kind of issue that we're combating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you frame this issue in that way as we look at what are the biggest challenges facing HOAs. I know at Action Property Management, we're having a lot of discussions these days around how do we change minds about how people are viewing an HOA and actually see their HOA as a positive value, not right now, I think oftentimes the best they hope for is that the HOA just be seen as maybe a necessary evil. But I think there's opportunity, and I think this is what you're getting at. There's opportunity to reshape that and to actually make the HOA a positive force and help people to see that. So you had referenced, as we look ahead as to what HOAs are going to be facing, you'd referenced that there's legislative impact, but that is in many ways directly related to or intertwined with homeowner satisfaction. So I guess maybe to start with, am I representing you correctly in that you are essentially pointing out that legislation is often a reaction to homeowner satisfaction with their HOAs, and maybe even to the point where the legislation is a reaction to maybe one-off situations or extreme situations that then results in laws that affect everyone. And you didn't say this, but I'm making the assumption that that's maybe not the greatest thing for HOAs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and keep in mind too that California is a completely different environment legislatively than other states. So taking the John Oliver segment as an example, some of the things that he talks about, that he references in that segment, don't apply or have any bearing on what we're doing in California, what we're required to do in California. In comparison to other states, California is incredibly homeowner friendly, and most of the legislation that we've seen over the last 20 plus years since the Davis-Sterling Act was enacted in 1986 have been to make hoops that homeowners associations have to jump through, which benefit the homeowner. And in many cases, those have been good things. They have been things that have served to protect homeowners and to encourage good governance and things like that. But in many cases, it's just increased the cost that associations have to endure, which, as everyone knows, those costs are ultimately borne by all of the homeowners. But to your point, I can't tell you how many times over the years in working in the Capitol and being involved in the legislative arena that it'll be one instance of bad conduct, or one legislator has a cousin who lives in an HOA and was facing, some issue, some dispute with their board. Or you might have sort of one, legislative advocate who really is sort of, distrustful of HOAs, generally speaking. And so a lot of the legislation has been born out of that sort of one-off situations where there's really no data to back it up. And yet when we come, to the table and make an argument in opposition to, as we do from time to time, to a certain piece of proposed legislation, the legislature is very quick to say, "Where's your data? Where's your data to say this isn't a problem?" And we want to say, "Where's your data to show that this is a problem?" Except for in maybe that one community that your staffer lives in or your family member lives in or whatever.
Yeah, it's always harder to show data for something that isn't as opposed to for something that is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, that's unfortunate because you could end up with situations where you have legislation enacted that is intended to protect homeowners, but if it's in a one-off or an extreme situation, that legislation could have the unintended consequence of actually creating higher costs for all homeowners in the name of protecting homeowners that there really may not be many, if any, that would fit into that category. So that is unfortunate. As we look forward, what are some of the legislative trends in California that you see coming up in coming years?
Yeah, good question. So I think a lot of it is related to the housing crisis. So in California, the legislature has been very focused on affordability and the number of housing units, and trying to increase density and eliminate sort of red tape for additional density and things like that. So we've seen over the last 5 years or so tons of legislation on ADUs, and I don't expect that we're done there. I think we're going to see more. We've seen some bills on lot splitting and on zoning. So, we've talked about in the industry SB 9 and SB 10, which were basically designed to allow a lot owner to increase the density in their, on their lot. And so you had essentially a situation where a single family residential lot owner could, if SB 9 and SB 10 both would have applied to homeowners associations, then the owner could split their lot, build two residences, build a JADU and an ADU on each one, or tear down their home and build a 10-unit, apartment building or things like that. And so it really is kind of counterintuitive, because the legislature relies on the community association housing model, because we're the only game in town when it comes to density that is also home ownership. Right. The only other type of density in California is apartments. And I don't think the legislature wants to just see apartments going in everywhere. I mean, it's part of the the so-called American dream is to own your home. And when you're talking about affordability, the most affordable housing unit that somebody can own is oftentimes a condominium unit or other type of common interest development. And so it's kind of counterintuitive in that regard, that they're essentially doing some things which change the very nature of a community, especially retroactively. And that's where oftentimes I personally have issues with what the legislature is doing. Right.
Well, as we look to other trends maybe coming up legislatively, obviously there was a huge impact by what happened in Florida with Champlain Towers, and I'm wondering, what do you expect will come of that as it relates to HOAs in California?
Yeah, there's two things really, and go a step back even further to the Berkeley balcony collapse. Right. And what you saw in California was Senator Hill pushing legislation that was kind of a compromise position, which requires balcony inspections and inspections of other elevated structures. And then fast forward to Champlain Towers in Florida, with the obvious tragedy there and the entire building collapsing. And you've got the entire country now looking at condos, especially high-rise and mid-rise condos, to try to assess what issues we need to be looking at in terms of long-term structural integrity issues. And so I think that what we saw in Florida relatively quickly in their legislative session was a bill that would require associations to carry reserves. In California, we've never had a mandate for an association to carry a certain amount of reserves. It's simply been a disclosure issue. They're either well-funded or not at all well-funded, or somewhere in between. And buyers have always had the opportunity to assess that before they go forward with, purchasing a unit in a particular community. And I think the issue that we'll see, and perhaps rightly so, I've kind of changed my perspective on this over the years, is that, as we know, owners often don't read the fine print. They don't read the documents. They're not internalizing and digesting what the reserve funding percentage, for example, really truly means. And if you're buying a condominium unit and the reserve funding percentage is 100%, that's wonderful. But if you're buying a condominium unit and the reserve funding percentage is 3%, that's a pretty bad, situation to be buying into, and it should really impact the purchase price. But oftentimes people don't know enough, and they're not advised well enough to understand the impact of the difference between those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one other topic that I wanted to touch on, at least as far as legislative trends that are coming up. Talk to us about electric vehicles and what you see happening with regard to electric vehicles and HOAs.
Yeah, good question. So we live in California. We see the Teslas all over. They're getting to be everywhere. The charging stations are getting to be everywhere. And we've seen a lot of legislation in recent years about charging stations in common interest developments, particularly in condominiums. Whether it be an owner who wants to install a charging station in the common area or things like that. And we've also seen a lot of associations actually, voluntarily installing charging stations in common areas and things like that. But again, it gets complicated when you're looking at putting these into existing communities, because some condominium projects, for example, the parking spaces are deeded to the owner versus they're just assigned by a rule or something like that. It's very difficult to manage the infrastructure, especially when the laws in the nation and in particular in California are changing to arguably push gas vehicles off the road completely. And so I think there's going to have to be a reckoning at some point in the future about how we're going to deal with all of the demand that we're going to be seeing for electric vehicle charging stations. So I think that's a big issue that we're facing, especially in California.
Probably an evolving one that will that still to some degree remains to be seen as to how that will play out.
Yep. Yeah. And I can add to one of the bills that we saw last year come out of the Capitol was a bill that is basically asking state officials to look at amending the building code, which is due next to be revised in 2025. And essentially what they're hoping to be able to do is when an association is doing work which requires a permit on the common area for the parking lot, for example, then the local jurisdiction could require the association to install electric vehicle charging stations at that point.
So as we look at all of these trends and what's happening legislatively, how do you see this affecting homeowner satisfaction with HOAs, the perception of HOAs? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, I think HOAs, as an industry, we have our work cut out for us, because I think we're dealing with both misperception about homeowner satisfaction in HOAs and also a sort of media problem in terms of how we're evolving, how we're growing, and I would add how we utilize technology in the mix there as well, because for legal reasons, associations have been sort of in the dinosaur age for a long time. And in that regard, COVID was kind of a wake-up call for our industry because we've been trying to get the legislature to allow us to kind of come into the modern age. And the pushback has always been, well, there's people who don't have email and there's people who don't have internet access and, all of those things. And I think after COVID, that argument is less concerning to the legislature. So we'll start to hopefully see things like electronic voting happening in the near future. That will be big because it will increase participation, which is one of the huge problems that we're facing is apathy in communities that are stuck, never being able to get their members engaged. And so, using social media and other communication tools are going to be more and more important going forward. If you would have asked me 10 years ago if boards should be thinking about social media, looking at social media, going on Nextdoor and seeing what people are saying, I would have just said, stay out of it. Don't have anything to do with it. And I think that, as time has gone by, we're getting more and more sort of pulled in that direction, and associations have their work cut out for them to be able to communicate effectively as times are changing. I mean, frankly, email is outdated now.
Right.
A lot of people aren't using email. They rely on apps and social media for their information, for their news and things like that. So we're still complaining about people not opening the mail. But we've kind of, now we're starting to even miss the next generation of communication, which is email. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting issue as well. Yeah.
Well, you've opened the door to a few different topics that I want to explore just a little bit further. One, just as a comment on the technology, agree with you wholeheartedly that the industry has been in the dark ages for a long time, technology-wise. COVID was a thrust forward in that way. But really, as an industry, we're going to have to figure out how to jump forward significantly and quickly. We look at even where we are, and this isn't the topic for this particular episode, but we have things coming to the forefront like ChatGPT, which is already evolving to, as we now look at the advent of Auto GPT and new developments in that whole area. And my point being, the HOA industry is starting off many steps behind where the rest of the world is going, and there's a need to catch up. And legislatively, that's going to have to be addressed, as well as just from an operational and practice standpoint. But with that, one of the things as we consider technology, and you mentioned emails become outdated, I'm curious as to what your thoughts. This is a conversation we're having on our side as a management company. But how do we communicate formally with homeowners? And what I mean by that is non-compliance notices, delinquent assessment notices, things where there's a formal need to communicate. It's not just a convenience. And what we're finding is people don't open their mail anymore because the only physical mail they receive is essentially junk mail. And then the same thing is happening in their email inbox. They're getting lots of spam and junk mail in their email inbox, and so they're not reading all of their email either. And so I think this is pushing to a conversation around how do we actually make connection and communicate effectively with homeowners in a homeowners association. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I thought I would at least bring that subject up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is we don't know, because really our next step is to be able to electronically vote, communicate more freely by email. We've been working on that for the last several years, and now at least we have some options and things like that. But I think for me, my rule of thumb is the more communication, the better. Whether it be, if we have to send something snail mail or certified mail, then we do that. but why not also send it electronically? And then of course, for general communication to the membership, I think we're going to have to start opening up to the idea of having engagement with social media, having the association have its own form of social media, apps, things like that, where we have the ability to communicate more proficiently than owners who are sort of raising issues or sort of trying to cause disputes with the association. So I do think, because you have the occasional board member who is kind of rowing in the wrong direction, we have to be careful when board members do get on social media that it's clear whether or not they're speaking on behalf of the association or not, because we don't want them to bind the association to a position or cause an admission that can be used against the association, really when they're acting outside the scope of their authority as a director, but just as a as a member of the community. So it's going to get more complicated, I think, before we see the path forward.
Yeah, and we're seeing even within the industry, there are differences of opinion. What you just expressed, I've heard some attorneys say, but I've also heard attorneys still currently saying to board members, don't go on social media, and even making the point that you can't take your board member hat off and on. You're always going to be a board member, and so don't engage at all. So I understand that from a conservative perspective, but on the other hand, it becomes really difficult to know what's going on in the community and to effectively engage the community if you're not participating in social media in some way. So I think as we look at trends going forward and what's happening in the industry, kind of figuring out even what the standard expectations are for boards, management companies, and how we should be relating on social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a big part of it.
And a big part of this communication issue is how this impacts not only homeowner satisfaction, but sort of the civility issue that we're having in homeowners associations, which we've seen an increase of harassment, discrimination, neighbor to neighbor disputes, and even frankly some violence that we've seen sort of a rise of people losing it with managers. I've had to do more civil harassment and restraining orders and workplace violence restraining orders in the last 2 years than I think I did the entire 10 years prior to that. So I think what we're seeing on the national level in terms of politics and things like that is permeating our communities. And so that's something that I'm watching very, very carefully as well.
Well, with regard to just kind of this increase in hostility and a reduction of civility in, I guess, society as a whole, and that being reflected within HOAs, where do you see things going with HOAs? And I guess how are we to think about this as it relates to what's happening in homeowners associations?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. It may get worse before it gets better. And unfortunately, associations have few tools to deal with these issues because a lot of these issues sort of butt right up against, the First Amendment rights of free speech and things like that. So whether it's political signage that contains vulgarity, or whether it's neighbors sort of arguing over politics, or whether it's just this sort of general laissez-faire attitude that I think a lot more people have today in the country and throughout California as well, in terms of you can't tell me what to do. I mean, this has always been a homeowners association problem. We've said, well, maybe some people don't belong in homeowners associations, and I don't mean that in a NIMBY way. I mean that if I was advising certain of my friends, I would say you should not live in a homeowners association, right? If there's a trade-off when you're buying into a community, there is a common vision, and that is protected by the board and the governing documents. And there are fail safes that are built into the system to prevent bad boards and things like that. But on the flip side, boards often have very little ability to deal with the most challenging, the most difficult homeowners who are, because we're talking about all this gray area in terms of defamation, First Amendment, political speech, right? All of these things, the law becomes, as you try to apply it to the facts, becomes very, very gray. And so, boards can fine homeowners and hold hearings, and there's due process and all of these things. But a lot of times, the most challenging, the most harmful, mistruths that we are seeing that associations are dealing with are the type of conduct that is difficult to regulate. And so I just think it's a big challenge. I wish I had a good answer, but I don't think there is a good answer other than changing the broader perception of HOAs and changing the narrative. HOAs serve a very valuable purpose. And not only, like I talked about earlier, in terms of creating density and providing home ownership and affordability and things like that, but in terms of preserving property values and providing some assurance to members that when they move into a community that it's going to look similar in 10 years. I think we all know when we drive through a community and it's new, it looks great. But 10 years later, you drive through a community, I think you can tell whether that community has an HOA or doesn't. And I don't think you're going to be surprised to hear me say that the community that looks nicer is the one that has an HOA.
I know there's actually
there are trade-offs.
Yeah, there's actually been a variety of studies done on the value of an HOA compared to homes not in an HOA, and I think there's numbers that are kind of all over the board, but I would say that it's probably a fair number to give. I think there was a CAI study actually here a number of years ago that put it at about a 10% bump in value for a home in an HOA to a comparable home not. Well, with all of this that's going on in HOAs, it seems that a lot of it is just a reflection of society as a whole and culture as a whole that's more divided. And so we see increase in hostility. There's this, as you've said, there's this kind of media onslaught that paints HOAs in a negative light. Where I'd want to just, I guess, kind of wrap this up is ask you, how do you think that compares to the reality of residents in an HOA? How do you think most people actually view their homeowners association?
Yeah, it's drastically different. I think that, for example, if you take the John Oliver segment as the anti-HOA position, HOAs are terrible. They don't effectively serve their intended purpose. They cause more damage than good. I honestly think that is very, very far from the truth. The reality is that the vast majority of HOAs, and I'll speak to California because that's my experience. I think we do have some additional protections and requirements in place that help to serve that purpose that maybe some other states don't have, but I suspect it's nationwide. I really believe that homeowners associations are incredibly useful. They serve a really great purpose. The vast majority of boards are doing a great job under difficult circumstances. We have to remember directors are volunteers. They're not specifically trained to operate and to govern. And so they're dealing with a very challenging legal landscape. And I think for the most part, they do a really wonderful job. And so I think it boils down to homeowner satisfaction is actually significantly higher. And in spite of, John Oliver showing a few messages, on a forum board about people, and their negative comments toward HOAs, the data actually shows exactly the opposite. I mean, you mentioned CAI's study. Part of that study a couple of years ago was indicated that 89% of homeowners are not dissatisfied with their HOAs. I think that is a significant part of the narrative that's just not being talked about. And in California, we actually had above average ratings in terms of homeowner satisfaction. So are there things that we can do to clean things up? Can we better, police ourselves? Is there some legislation that maybe would help in some of these issues? Yeah, here and there. But I think that the narrative that people often have, this sort of negative connotation of an HOA, is just completely wrong.
Yeah. Well, that 89% number is an important one, and we need to make that more known and to reflect that in a lot of different ways. But I think that's a good place to wrap up. We'll just continue to talk about this subject and continue to push forward to turn the narrative and highlight the great value that there is in HOAs and shore up the places where maybe it's detracting from that overall message. So appreciate your time, Nathan, and your perspective. I think that this was really helpful. And I hope that you continue to look to the Uncommon Area for additional episodes on other topics that we address related to HOAs.